I don't want to get too far into this, but critical thinking skills can sometimes, especially when you're talking about politics, go away from people.
Yeah.
And my favorite example of historical irony is in this book. Tsar Alexander II is assassinated, right? He is a czar, so of course anarchists are going to be after him. He is assassinated, and it's darkly funny. He is by far, to me, the most liberal czar of all time.
Yeah,
he was trying to move towards precisely what the anarchists and anybody who was, quote unquote, liberal thinking of that time, he was their guy. And they killed him. And then you just get, because anarchy doesn't have a spokesperson, it's, all right, well, who called for that? Well, nobody calls for it because nobody's in charge. They just kind of did it. Well, are they anarchists? Well, it depends on who you're talking to. And I think that's where, historically you look back at anarchists and it doesn't make sense to someone who isn't reading a lot about this. And the way you're bringing it out in this book to be like, hey, it doesn't make sense when you're looking at it from, a 10,000-foot view. You got to get a little bit deeper.
It's interesting about the assassination of Alexander II because I had initially just planned to kind of refer to it. It's a very important moment for Goldman and Berkman. It's an important moment in the history of terrorism. It's the world's first suicide bomber, kind of blows himself up next to Alexander II. So my thought was I would just, kind of allude to it quickly in a couple of paragraphs because I'm off to telling the story about, life in New York really in the early 20th century, and this takes place in 1881. But it's one of these cases where the more I dug into the story, the more I realized I had to actually have a couple chapters on it for two reasons. One is there is an insane, we don't need to get into the details of this, but there is an insane kind of preamble to this assassination attempt where the radicals, who were also called nihilists at that point, try to kill Alexander II 10 times. And there are all these kind of Keystone Cops routines where they set the bomb under the bridge and then the guy oversleeps, or they accidentally blow up the fruit car instead of the car on the train that the Tsar is in, and all these things. So there's this kind of insane sequence of just all the attempts on his life. And then the actual attempt that succeeds is very kind of gruesome and important historically. The other reason I wanted to dive into it a little bit more than I had initially planned is precisely what you're saying, which is it led to the exact opposite set of outcomes that the people who were assassinating or attempting to assassinate the Tsar had wanted, right? It ushered in the reign of Alexander III, who was incredibly repressive and demolished all the kind of democratization plans. It was terrible for the Russian Jews. All these things that, the anarchists have been fighting for got much worse because they had finally killed the Tsar. That really sets up the overarching narrative of the rest of the book, which is in this battle to create a decentralized state without, top-down forms of authority, the anarchists actually end up creating what we now call the surveillance state. They end up creating institutions like Interpol in Europe and the modern FBI, which in very clear ways emerged specifically in response to the threat posed by anarchism. This is not just that they were part of the problem. They were the initial conference that started Interpol, which is kind of the network of investigative agencies in Europe, the first international investigative body. It was a conference in Rome in 1898 that was called the Conference for Dealing with Anarchy. That was literally the title of the conference. It was paraphrased slightly, but anarchy was in the name. And in the events of Infernal Machine are very much about how that happens in the United States, really during the teens. And so the Alexander II story is really just a kind of a preview of coming attractions of what happens when a certain attempt to bring about a new revolutionary state ends up triggering the exact opposite of what you were trying to bring about.